All right. Chapter 5 is called Into War. It starts on page 40. And remember that chapter 4 is the Berlin Olympics. And Louis has an awesome comeback in his race. He doesn't win, doesn't medal, but he still sets his sight on the Tokyo Olympics, which would be 4 years from then. But we saw all throughout Berlin signs of Nazi Germany. And remember that the athletes who stayed after the Olympics started to see the signs of anti-Semitism or that anti-Jewish behavior coming out. It had been hidden for the Olympics, but then came out as soon as they were over. And that was kind of our foreshadowing that World War II is about to start. And so here as chapter 5 starts, it's called Into War. Please follow along as I read. Again, we're on page 40. At the University of Southern California, Louis found himself on a campus infested with world-class track athletes. He spent mornings in class and afternoons training with his best friend, Peyton Jordan. A sensationally fast sprinter, Jordan had seen nothing but Jesse Owens' back at the 1936 Olympic trials, and like Louis, was aiming for gold in Tokyo. In the evenings, Louis, Jordan, and their teammates wedged into Louis' 31 Ford and drove to Torrance for Louise Zamperini's spaghetti, considering themselves so close to family that Sylvia once found a high jumper asleep on her bed. In his spare time, Louis crashed society weddings, worked as a movie extra, and harassed his housemates with practical jokes, replacing their deviled ham with cat food and milk with milk of magnesia, which is a laxative that's going to make them poop. He pursued co-eds by all means necessary, once landing a date with a beauty by hurling himself into the side of her car, then pretending to have been struck. So there's a way to get a date, pretend like someone ran you over. Between classes, Louis, Jordan, and their friends congregated near the administration building, sitting at the foot of the statue of Tommy Trojan, the symbol of USC. On some days, they were joined by a neatly dressed Japanese emigre who had lingered on the edges of the group. His name was Kenichi James Sasaka, known as Jimmy. He had come to America in his late teens and settled in Palo Alto, where he had endured the social misery of attending elementary school as an adult. Among Louis' friends, no one would remember what Sasaki studied at USC, but they all recalled his quiet, anodyne presence. Anodyne means you're not going to offend anyone. So this guy is a Japanese immigrant. He's kind of just around. Saying almost nothing, he smiled without interruption. This is a small little blip in our story, but he will come back again. So keep in mind that Louis had this random guy that he went to USC with who doesn't seem to bother anyone or seem of real importance at the time. But we still have him mentioned here, which means he's worth remembering. Sasaki was an ardent track fan. He loved track, and he sought Louis' acquaintance. Louis was especially impressed with Sasaki's scholarliness, or like how he was academic. Prior to coming to USC, Jimmy said he had earned degrees at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. Bonding over shared interests in sports and music, the two became good friends. And here you can see Louis in his track days. Awesome. Louis and Jimmy had something else in common. Sometime over the course of their friendship, Louis learned that his friend was making daily trips to Torrance. He asked Jimmy if he lived there, and Jimmy said no. He explained that he was concerned about the poverty of his Japanese homeland and was going to Torrance to give lectures to locals of Japanese ancestry, encouraging them to send money and foil from cigarette packs and gum wrappers to Japan to help the poor. Louis admired his friend for his efforts, but found it odd that he would travel to Torrance every day, given how few Japanese lived there. Now, this is weird, right? It's like, why is he doing this? Louis is noticing something strange, but doesn't think a ton of it. Also, just note, there's Louis' track shoes, and it says when he wore these, he never lost a race. Carrying on. Jimmy Sasaki wasn't what he seemed. He had never attended Harvard, Yale, or Princeton, which we could have assumed, right? That's a pretty big lineup. His friends thought him about 30, but he was in fact nearly 40. He had a wife and 2 daughters, though neither Louis nor his friends knew that they existed. Though he spent a lot of time on campus and led everyone to believe that he was a student, he was not. He had graduated from USC some 10 years earlier with a BA in political science. Neither Louis nor anyone else knew that Jimmy's attempts to pass as a student were apparently an elaborate ruse. All right, keep that in mind. He's not really stupid. On USA's track team, Louis was a juggernaut. He was a powerful force, focused on winning Tokyo in 1940. He smashed record after record at multiple distances and routinely buried his competition by giant margins, once winning a race by 100 yards. By the spring of 1938, he'd whittled his mile time down to 4:13.7, some 7 seconds off the world record, which now stood at 4:06.4. His coach predicted that Louis would take that record down. The only runner who could beat him, the coach said, was Seabiscuit. If you're unfamiliar with the story, Seabiscuit's a horse. It's also a movie, so if you're into horses, check it out. One afternoon in 1938, Glenn Cunningham stood in the Los Angeles Coliseum locker room, talking with reporters after winning a race. "There's the next mile champion," he said, leveling his eyes across the room. "When he concentrates on this distance, he'll be unbeatable." The reporters turned to see who Cunningham was looking at. It was Louis, blushing to the roots of his hair. Remember, Glenn Cunningham is Louis' childhood hero. In the 1930s, track experts were beginning to toss around the idea of a 4-minute mile. Most observers, including Cunningham, had long believed it couldn't be done. In 1935, when Cunningham's record of 4:06 reigned, science weighed in. Studying data on human structural limits compiled by Finnish mathematicians, famed track coach Brutus Hamilton penned an article for Amateur Athlete magazine stating that a 4-minute mile was impossible. The fastest a human could run a mile, he wrote, was 4:01.6. Okay, so this made me curious. I had to go and look up when the 4-minute mile was broken because it has been broken. It was broken in 1956, and then if you look now, just, handy Wikipedia page, all of the top 25 fastest mile times are all under 4 minutes, which is crazy. The current fastest is 3:43 for a mile. That blows my mind. I do not know how to pronounce this guy's name, but let's go with Hicham El Garouj. He's from Morocco, and it was broken in 1999. That is crazy. But given the technology of shoes and the track and all of those things, it had never been done during Louis' time. But as they're saying, the 4-minute mile cannot be done. Don't worry, Pete disagreed. Since the Olympics, he'd been certain that Louis had a 4-minute mile in him. Louis had always shaken this off, but in the spring of '38, he reconsidered. His coach had forbidden him to run hills on the mistaken but common belief that it would damage his heart. It actually is great speed training, we now know. But Louis didn't buy the warnings. Every night that May, he climbed the Coliseum fence, dropping into the stadium, and ran the stairs until his legs went numb. Which, remember, we keep talking about Louis' determination and how much he'll push himself. If you've ever run hills or run stairs, it's like the worst torture of all time. So Louis is just so determined to get to the Tokyo Olympics. So he's going to just push himself. And remember that determination is a really important part of Louis' character. By June, his body was humming, capable of speed and stamina beyond anything he'd ever known. He began to think that Pete was right, and he wasn't alone. Running pundits or experts, including Olympic champion sprinter Charlie Paddock, published articles stating that Louis could be the first 4-minute man. Cunningham, too, had changed his mind. He thought that 4 minutes might be within Louis' reach. Zamperini, Cunningham told a reporter, was more likely to crack 4 minutes than he was. By June of 1938, Louis arrived at the NCAA championships in Minneapolis, gunning for 4 minutes. Spilling over with eagerness, he babbled to other athletes about his new training regimen, his race strategy, and how fast he might go. Word spread that Louis was primed for a superlative performance. On the night before the race, a coach from Notre Dame knocked on Louis' hotel room door, a grave expression on his face. He told Louis that some of his rival coaches were ordering their runners to sharpen their spikes, their track spikes on their shoes, and slash him. Louis dismissed the warning, certain that no one would do such a thing deliberately. He was wrong. Halfway through the race, just as Louis was about to move for the lead, several runners shouldered around him, boxing him in. Louis tried repeatedly to break loose, but he couldn't get around the other men. Suddenly, the man beside him swerved and stomped on his foot, impaling Louis' toe with his spike. A moment later, the man ahead began kicking backwards, cutting both of Louis' shins. A third man elbowed Louis' chest so hard that he cracked Louis' rib. The crowd gasped. Bleeding and in pain, Louis was trapped. For a lap and a half he ran in the cluster of men, unable to get free, restraining his stride to avoid running into the man ahead. So he keeps running, even though his rib is cracked, his foot and his legs are bleeding from these track spikes. At last, he neared the final turn. He saw a tiny gap open before him. He burst through, blew past the race leader, and with his shoe torn open, shins streaming blood, and chest aching, won easily. So even as he's seriously injured, he still blows it out of the water. You can see up here, it said that this is his record-breaking victory. And you can see his shins are all bandaged. He's all torn up. He slowed to a halt, bitter and frustrated. When his coach asked him how fast he thought he had gone, Louis replied that he couldn't have beaten 4:20. The race time was posted on the board. From the stands came a sudden "Woo!" Louis had run the mile in 4:08:3. It was the fastest mile in NCAA history and the 5th fastest outdoor mile ever run. Louis had missed the world record by 1.9 seconds. His time would stand as the NCAA record for 15 years. Weeks later, Japan withdrew as host of the 1940 Olympics, and the Games were transferred to Finland. Adjusting his aspirations from Tokyo to Helsinki in Finland, Louis rolled on. He won every race he contested in the 1939 school season. In the early months of 1940, in a series of Eastern indoor miles, again against the best runners in America, he was magnificent, taking 2 seconds and 2 close fourths, twice beating Cunningham and getting progressively faster. In February at the Boston Garden, he ran a 4:08:2, 0.6 of a second short of the fastest indoor mile ever run. At Madison Square Garden 2 weeks later, he scorched a 4:07:9, caught just before the tape by the great Chuck Finsky, whose time equaled the indoor world record. With the Olympics months away, Louis was peaking at the ideal moment. So he's just ready to go, wipe everyone out, and make it to the Olympics. As Louis blazed through college, far away, history was turning. In Europe, Hitler was laying plans to conquer the continent. In Asia, Japan's leaders had designs of equal magnitude. Poor in natural resources, its trade crippled by high tariffs and low demand, Japan was struggling to support a growing population. Which, remember, as we've been talking about Pearl Harbor, we've talked a lot about this, that Japan doesn't have resources because it's this small island, and so they've expanded into much of Asia, and this is creating conflict with the U.S. and with the West. And so as Japan is expanding, there's tension with the U.S. building. Eyeing their nation's resource-rich neighbors, Japan's leaders saw the prospect of economic independence and something more, meaning if they can conquer some of these other countries with more resources, maybe they wouldn't need to trade with other countries. They could be independent. They could function on their own. Central to the Japanese identity was the belief that it was Japan's divinely mandated right. So it's like from the gods for Japan, they have the right to rule its fellow Asians, whom it saw as inherently inferior. So this is saying part of the Japanese identity is they believe that they are the superior race, and so it's their right to rule other people. Now, this is really concerning during World War II because we know that this was part of what Hitler believed and part of what led to the Holocaust. We also, though, have to think about when we talk about U.S. history, we talk about manifest destiny and the belief that God wanted Americans to rule all of what is now the United States, East Coast to West Coast, and that led to a lot of genocide with Native Americans, right? So this is something that we look down on the Japanese for this, but we have to acknowledge that this is in European history, this is in U.S. history, but regardless of where it is, this leads to violence, and this is going to be really important to our story. There are superior and inferior races in the world, said the Japanese politician Nakajima Chikuhi in 1940, and it is the sacred duty of the leading race to lead and enlighten the inferior ones. Again, very problematic to say that one race is better than another race. Every instance of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, racial violence that we've ever seen has come from this idea that one race is better than the other race. Very problematic. The Japanese, he continued, are the sole superior race of the world. Moved by necessity and destiny, Japan's leaders planned to plant the blood of the Yamato Japanese race on their neighboring nation's soil. They were going to subjugate all of the Far East, or make all of the rest of those Asian countries under Japanese power. That's what subjugate means. Japan's military-dominated government had long been preparing for its quest. Over decades, it had crafted a muscular, technologically sophisticated army and navy, and through a military-run school system that relentlessly and violently drilled children on the nation's imperial destiny, it had shaped its people for war, meaning that military is really crucial to the Japanese identity and that kids are taught this idea that the Japanese should rule from a very young age. Finally, through intense indoctrination, beatings, and desensitization, its army cultivated and celebrated extreme brutality in its soldiers, meaning Japanese soldiers are taught that they should be violent, that they shouldn't have mercy, that they should act in really harsh ways. And as we get farther into our story, the way that the Japanese military has taught its soldiers to be is going to be really, really important. Imbuing violence with holy meaning, wrote the historian Iris Chang. So this means they're teaching people that violence is meaningful because it's what they should be doing. The Japanese Imperial Army made violence a cultural imperative, every bit as powerful as that which propelled the Europeans during the Crusades and the Spanish Inquisition. So this is pointing out that Europeans did awful things, killing Muslim people in the name of Catholicism. And so they believed that it was the right thing to do, and that's how they justified these really violent acts. Well, here, the Japanese are doing the same thing. They're justifying these really violent, terrible acts with the belief that they think it's the right thing to do. Chang cited a 1933 speech by a Japanese general. Every single bullet must be charged with the imperial way, and the end of every bayonet must have the national virtue burnt into it. In 1931, Japan tested the waters, invading the Chinese province of Manchuria and setting up a fiercely oppressive puppet state. This was only the beginning. So Japan is starting to conquer China as they start to spread and make sure that their power can hold over more of Asia. In the late 1930s, both Germany and Japan were ready to move. Remember, Hitler's expanding through Europe, or he will be, in the same way. It was Japan that struck first in 1937, sending its armies smashing into the rest of China. 2 years later, Hitler invaded Poland. America, long isolationist, meaning they're not going to get involved, found itself pulled into both conflicts. In Europe, its allies lay in Hitler's path, right? So U.S. allies are the people who Hitler's conquering. In the Pacific, its longtime ally, China, was being ravaged by the Japanese, and its territories in Hawaii, Wake, Guam, and Midway, as well as its Commonwealth of the Philippines, were threatened. The world was falling into catastrophe. And we note here that while the U.S. is really critical of Hitler and of Japan taking over these other countries, the Philippines, Hawaii, these are all places that the U.S. was concerned about because the U.S. had taken over these countries for their resources, or these places. So anyway, keeping that in mind, that's why it has this list of other islands. On a dark day in April 1940, Louis returned to his bungalow to find the USC campus buzzing. Hitler had unleashed his blitzkrieg across Europe. His Soviet allies had followed, and the continent had exploded into total war. Finland, which was set to host the Summer Games, was reeling. Helsinki's Olympic Stadium was partially collapsed, toppled by Soviet bombs. Gunnar Hockert, who had beaten Louis and won gold for Finland in the 5,000 in Berlin, was dead, killed defending his homeland. The Olympics had been canceled. And so this is a turning point. Up until now, our book has been all about Louis working toward the Olympics and learning to be a runner. And from this point forward, there are no Olympics. Louis was unmoored. He felt like he had no anchor. He became ill, first with food poisoning, then with pleurisy, which is a lung disease. His speed abandoned him, and he lost race after race. When USC's spring semester ended, he collected his class ring and left campus. He was a few credits short of a degree, but he had all of 1941 to make them up. He took a job as a welder at the Lockheed Air Corporation and mourned his lost Olympics, right? Track and running was the thing that had anchored Louis, brought him back to his good side, and so now he doesn't know what to do. As Louis worked through the summer of 40, America slid toward war. In Europe, Hitler had driven the British and their allies into the sea at Dunkirk. Dunkirk movie, if you've seen it. In the Pacific, Japan was tearing through China and moving into Indochina. In an effort to stop Japan, President Franklin Roosevelt imposed ever-increasing embargoes on materials such as scrap metal and aviation fuel. Embargoes means they're going to limit trade with Japan. And so while President Roosevelt is not fighting against Japan, he's going to stop trading with them. And Japan desperately needs oil and metal in order to keep invading these other countries. So this is going to be something that Japan will see as hostile to them, because if they don't trade, then clearly America is against Japan by not trading with them. In the coming months, he would declare an oil embargo, freeze Japanese assets in America, and then finally declare a total trade embargo, meaning they're not going to trade with Japan. Japan pushed on. Lockheed was on a war footing, punching out aircraft for the Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force. From the hangar where he worked, Louis could see P-38 fighters cruising overhead. Ever since his trip in the air as a boy, he'd been uneasy about planes, but watching the P-38s, he felt a pull. He was still feeling it in September when Congress enacted a draft bill. Those who enlisted prior to being drafted could choose their service branch. In early 1941, Louis joined the Army Air Corps. Sent to Hancock College of Aeronautics in Santa Maria, California, Louis learned that flying a plane was nothing like watching it from the ground. He was jittery and dogged by air sickness. He washed out of the Air Corps, signed papers that he didn't bother to read, and got a job as a movie extra. He was working on the set of They Died with Their Boots On, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland, when a letter arrived. He'd been drafted, so they signed him up for the military. The induction date fell before the Flynn film would wrap, and Louis stood to earn a bonus if he stayed through the shoot. Just before his Army physical, he ate a fistful of candy bars. Thanks to the consequent soaring blood sugar, he failed the physical. Ordered to return a few days later to retake the test, he went back to the set and earned his bonus. Then, on September 29th, he joined the Army. When he finished basic training, he had an unhappy surprise. Because he hadn't read his Air Corps washout papers, he had no idea that he'd agreed to rejoin the Air Corps for future service. In November 1941, he arrived at Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. The military was going to make him a bombardier, and here he is in his flight clothes. Remember from the very beginning when our book opened with the Zeppelin moment, it talks about how the last thing Louis ever wants to do is be up in the air. He tried to go up in the air once, he found out he got really scared and sick, and here he is going up again. That fall, while Louis was on his way to becoming an airman, an urgent letter landed on the desk of J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. It had come from a brigadier general of the War Department, Military Intelligence Division. The letter said that a credible informant had warned military officials that a California man, believed to be working from an innocuous or something that won't harm you, local Japanese organization, had in fact been an employee of the Japanese Navy on assignment to raise money for Japan's war effort. Japanese naval superiors had recently transferred the man to Washington, D.C., the informant said, to continue acting under their orders. According to the informant, the man was known as Mr. Sasaki. It was Louis' friend, Jimmy. So there was this fear in America that Japanese immigrants would be actually trying to help Japan during this time. For the most part, that fear just led to a lot of racism and wasn't true at all. But interestingly, this was one of the rare cases where this actually was true. There was an informant, and it happened to be Louis' friend, who we heard about at the beginning of the chapter. Though the surviving records of the informant's report contain no details of Sasaki's alleged activities, according to notes made later by a captain of the Torrance Police, Sasaki had been making visits to a field adjacent to a power station just off of Torrance Boulevard. There, he had erected a powerful radio transmitter, which he used to send information to the Japanese government. If the allegation was true, it would explain Sasaki's mysterious trips to Torrance. Louis' good friend may have been a spy. Sasaki had indeed moved to Washington, D.C. in the employ of the Japanese Navy. He worked in the Japanese embassy and lived in an apartment building popular among congressmen. He made himself well known among the Washington elite, mixing with legislators at building cocktail parties, playing golf at the Army-Navy Country Club, socializing with police officers and State Department officials, and volunteering to serve as chauffeur after parties. Just whose side he was on is unclear. At a cocktail party, he gave the congressman sensitive information on Japanese aircraft manufacturing. The letter to the FBI set off alarm bells. Hoover, concerned enough to plan on informing the Secretary of State, ordered an immediate investigation of Sasaki. Not long after sunrise, on a Sunday in December, a pilot guided a small plane over the Pacific. Below him, the dark sea gave way to a strand of white, waves slapping the northern tip of Oahu Island. The plane flew into a brilliant Hawaiian morning. Oahu was beginning to stir. At Hickam Field, soldiers were washing a car. On Hula Lane, a family was dressing for Mass. At the Officers' Club at Wheeler Field, men were leaving a poker game. In the barracks, 2 men were in the midst of a pillow fight. At Iwa Morning Mass Field, a technical sergeant was peering through the lens of a camera at his 3-year-old son. Hardly anyone had made it to the mess halls yet. Now, this is important because what our author is trying to set up for you here is this idea that it's just a normal Sunday morning. It's beautiful, it's calm, these people are not at work, they're not at war, and that makes what's about to happen all the more shocking, and that made Americans really, really upset, was that this was just a calm Sunday morning. And Sunday specifically because there's people who are going to church, and so it's seen as an even more unfair time for this to happen. Quite a few were still sleeping in their bunks in the warships, gently swaying in the harbor. Aboard the USS Arizona, an officer was about to suit up to play in the United States Fleet Championship baseball game. On deck, men were assembling to raise flags as a band played the national anthem, a Sunday morning tradition. Far above them, the pilot counted 8 battleships, the Pacific Fleet's full complement. There was a faint sheet of fog settled low to the ground. The plane's name was Mitsuo Fuchida. The pilot's name, not the plane's name. He rolled back the canopy of his plane and sent a flare skidding green across the sky, then ordered his radio men to tap out a battle cry. Behind Fuchida, 180 Japanese planes peeled away and dove for Oahu. On the deck of the Arizona, the men looked up. In the barracks, one of the men in the pillow fight suddenly fell to the floor. He was dead, a 3-inch hole blown through his neck. His friend ran to a window and saw a building heave upward and crumble down. A dive bomber had crashed straight into it. There were red circles on its wings, and the red circles would be the sign that this is a Japanese plane. Pete Zamperini was at a friend's house that morning, playing a few hands on a high-low jack before heading out for a round of golf. Behind him, the sizzle of waffles on a griddle competed with the chirp of a radio. An urgent voice interrupted the broadcast. The players put down their cards. In Texas, Louis was in a theater on a weekend pass. The theater was thick with servicemen, taking breaks from endless drilling that was the life of the peacetime soldier. Midway through the showing, the screen went blank. Light flooded the theater, and a man hurried to the stage. Is there a fire? Louis wondered. All servicemen must return to their bases immediately, the man said. Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor. Louis would long remember, sitting there with his eyes wide, his mind floundering. America was at war. He grabbed his hat and ran from the building. So you can look at how the plane, the B-24, is set up here. But as Pearl Harbor's attacked, that's what's going to bring the U.S. into the war. Because up until this point, while they've kind of been helping their allies, they've technically not been in the war yet. From this point on, things are going to get very different for the U.S. If you're interested, the USS Arizona, which is what Laura Hillenbrand just mentioned here, is the ship that is still submerged in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It's where the memorial for Pearl Harbor is. You can go and see the ship underwater. So just do some Googling of USS Arizona and you can see pictures of that. And on that note, we made it to part 2 and we will continue next time.